The bidding had stalled at $18. The girl standing on the platform outside the courthouse in Copper Falls was 19 years old, and heavy enough that the auctioneer had made a joke about her weight before the bidding started. Something about getting your money's worth in muscle. And half the crowd had laughed. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, and her eyes fixed on the ground, and she did not flinch when the auctioneer said, "Come on now, gentlemen. She is strong as an ox and twice as useful. $18 is a steal for 5 years of indenture." The crowd murmured. A few men shook their heads. One man spat tobacco juice into the dirt and walked away. The auctioneer was about to drop his gavel and declare the sale final, when a voice from the back of the crowd said, "$40. Every head turned. The man who had spoken was massive, 6.5 feet tall and built like he had been carved from the mountain itself. He walked through the crowd with his hat in his hands, and when he reached the platform, he looked up at the girl and said, $40, cash, right now." The auctioneer blinked. He said, "Sir, the bid was only 18. The man said, "I know what the bid was. I am offering 40. Do you want it or not?" The auctioneer said, "Sold," and the town of Copper Falls fell completely silent. If you have ever watched someone pay twice what something cost just to prove a point, you know the electricity running through that crowd right now. This is the story of a girl sold into service because her family could not feed her, and the mountain man who paid double to make sure everyone understood exactly what she was worth. If stories like this make you believe in people again, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story can reach. Because what that crowd did not know, staring at the mountain man who had just silenced them all with $40 in cash, was that he had not come to town looking for an indentured servant. He had come looking for supplies. But the moment he saw that girl standing on the platform, with her eyes down and her hands shaking, he decided some things were worth more than supplies, and he was about to prove it. The girl's name was Abigail Farrow. She had been born in Copper Falls in the winter of 1875, the fourth of 7 children, in a family that had never had enough of anything. Not food, not money, not hope. Her father worked the mill when there was work, and drank when there was not. Her mother took in washing and mending, and died when Abigail was 12, worn down to nothing by pregnancies and poverty, and the slow erosion of trying to keep 7 children alive on wages that barely kept one person fed. After her mother died, Abigail became the mother. She cooked and cleaned and cared for her younger siblings, while her father disappeared into the bottom of whatever bottle he could afford. By the time she was 16, she was the only thing holding the family together. By the time she was 18, her father had drunk himself into debt so deep the bank was threatening to take the house. And by the time she was 19, her father had made a choice. He signed a contract of indenture. 5 years of service to whoever would pay enough to clear his debts. He sold his daughter the way other men sold livestock. And Abigail, who had spent 19 years learning that her body was something people had opinions about, too big, too slow, too much, stood on that platform and waited to see who would buy her. The mountain man's name was Silas Granger. He was 46 years old. He had been living alone in the mountains north of Copper Falls for 16 years, trapping and hunting and trading pelts for the things he could not make himself. He came into town twice a year, once in spring, once in fall, to sell furs and buy supplies. He did not talk to people. He did not socialize. He bought what he needed, loaded his mule, and left. But on this particular October morning in 1894, he walked into Copper Falls and saw a crowd gathered outside the courthouse, and something made him stop. He saw the girl on the platform. He saw the way she held herself, rigid, braced, like she was waiting for a blow. He saw the auctioneer gesture at her body like it was a defect that needed explaining. He saw the men in the crowd assess her the way they would assess a horse, checking her teeth, her hands, her ability to work. And he saw her father standing off to the side, looking at the ground, not meeting anyone's eyes. Silas had seen a lot of ugly things in 46 years, but watching a man sell his daughter because he was too weak to carry his own debts was one of the ugliest. So when the bidding stalled at $18, Silas decided $18 was not enough. Not nearly enough. He paid $40 in cash. He signed the indenture contract. and then he walked up onto the platform, looked at Abigail and said, "What is your name?" She looked up at him. She had brown eyes and a round face, and an expression that said she had stopped expecting kindness a long time ago. She said, "Abigail." He said, "I am Silas. I live in the mountains. It is a 2-day walk from here. The work is hard, but I will feed you and I will not hurt you. Do you understand?" She nodded. He said, "Get your things." She said, "I do not have any things." He looked at her dress, patched so many times it was more patch than dress, and her shoes, which were held together with twine. He said, "Then we leave now." They walked out of Copper Falls with the entire town watching. Silas did not look back. Abigail did. She looked back once at her father, who was still standing by the courthouse with $40 in his hand and his eyes on the ground. She did not cry. She did not say goodbye. She just turned around and followed the mountain man who had paid double to make sure no one could say she was not worth it. They walked for 2 days. Silas set a pace Abigail could manage, and when she stumbled, he slowed down. He did not talk much. At night, he made camp and cooked salt pork and beans over a fire, and he gave her the larger portion without comment. On the second night, when they were halfway up the mountain, and the temperature had dropped enough that Abigail could see her breath, Silas gave her his extra blanket. She said, "You will be cold." He said, "I have been colder." She wrapped herself in the blanket and fell asleep listening to the wind in the trees, and wondering what kind of man paid double for something, and then gave away what he needed to make sure it survived. Silas's cabin was small and solid, built from logs he had cut himself, with a stone fireplace and a loft for sleeping. There was one room with a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and shelves lined with traps and tools and supplies. It smelled like wood smoke and leather, and the kind of cleanliness that comes from a man who has lived alone long enough to develop systems. Silas set down his pack. He said, "You sleep in the loft. I sleep down here. There is a creek a 1/4 mile east for water. The privy is behind the cabin. I check trap lines most days. You will cook, clean, mend, and help with the pelts when I bring them in. I do not expect conversation. I do not expect company. I expect work. Do you understand?" Abigail said, "Yes, sir." He looked at her. He said, "Do not call me sir. My name is Silas." She said, "Yes, Silas." The first week was hard. Abigail had worked her entire life, but she had never worked like this. She hauled water from the creek until her shoulders burned. She scrubbed pelts until her hands were raw. She cooked over a wood stove that required constant tending. She learned how to split kindling and stack firewood, and patch the holes in Silas's shirts with threads so fine it was nearly invisible. Silas did not praise her. He did not criticize her. He simply expected the work to be done, and when it was done, he nodded once and went back to whatever he was doing. At night, Abigail climbed into the loft and lay on the straw mattress Silas had made for her, and she tried to understand what her life had become. But she also noticed things. She noticed that Silas always made sure there was enough food. He hunted and trapped and brought back meat, and he divided it evenly between them. He never took more than his share. She noticed that when the weather turned cold, Silas built up the fire in the stove before he went to check his trap lines, so the cabin would be warm when she woke. She noticed that when her shoes finally fell apart completely, Silas spent an entire evening making her a new pair from hide he had been saving for his own boots. He did not say anything when he gave them to her. He just set them by the stove and went back to his work. One night in late November, after Abigail had been at the cabin for 6 weeks, Silas came in from the trap lines covered in blood. It was not his blood. It was from a wolf he had killed after it went after him near the North Ridge. He was not badly hurt, a few scratches, a torn sleeve, but the wolf had been big and the fight had been close, and Silas moved like a man who had just narrowly avoided something bad. Abigail was at the stove making supper. She turned, saw the blood, and said, "Sit down." Silas looked at her. She said it again. "Sit down. Now." He sat. Abigail fetched water and cloth. She cleaned the scratches on his arm and his neck. She sewed the torn sleeve, and when she finished, she said, "You could have died." Silas said, "Yes." She said, "What would have happened to me if you had died?" He looked at her. He said, The indenture contract says you go back to auction if I die before the term is complete. You would be sold again. She said, to who? He said, whoever bid highest. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, so if you die, I go back on that platform. He said, yes. She said, then do not die. Something in his face changed. He said, are you asking me to be careful because you do not want to be sold again, or because you do not want me to die? She looked at him. She said, both. He said, which one more? She said, I do not know yet. After that, things shifted. Silas started talking to her. Not a lot, but more than before. He told her about his trap lines. He explained how to read animal tracks. He taught her how to skin a rabbit and cure a hide and set a snare. He asked her about her life before the auction, and when she told him about her mother and her siblings and the years of holding a family together with nothing but stubbornness and prayer, he said, you should not have had to do that. She said, someone had to. He said, it should not have been you. She said, why not? He said, because you were a child, and children should not have to raise other children because their parents cannot. Abigail had never thought about it that way. She had never thought about what she deserved or did not deserve. She had only thought about what needed to be done. But sitting in that cabin with Silas looking at her like she mattered, she started to wonder if maybe there was a difference between surviving and living, and if maybe she was allowed to want the second thing. Winter came hard that year. The snow fell for days without stopping, and the world outside the cabin disappeared into white. Silas and Abigail were trapped inside for a week, and during that week, they talked more than they had in the previous 3 months combined. They started with small things. Silas told her about the trap lines, which routes were most productive, which areas to avoid in different seasons, how to read the weather by watching the sky and the behavior of animals. Abigail told him about the recipes her mother had taught her, the ones she had not been able to make since her mother died because her father never bought the ingredients. Silas said, make them now. Whatever you need, tell me. I will get it next time I go to town. They progressed to larger things. Silas told her about the wife he had lost 17 years ago, not to childbirth or illness, but to a riding accident that had killed her instantly and left him so broken he had walked into the mountains and not come back. Her name had been Catherine. She had been 23 years old. They had been married for 2 years. He said, I did not know how to be a person after she died, so I stopped trying. I came up here and I decided, if I was alone, nothing could hurt me again. Abigail said, did it work? He said, for a while, and then it stopped working, and then I saw you on that platform. He told her he had not spoken to another person for months at a time during those first years. He told her he had forgotten what it was like to care whether he lived or died. He told her there had been days when he stood at the edge of a cliff and thought about stepping off, not because he wanted to die, but because he could not remember why he wanted to live. And then he said, and then I saw you on that platform, and I was angry, not at you, at them, at the town, at your father, at the whole system that puts people on platforms and sells them like cattle. And I thought, if I could get you off that platform, maybe it would mean something. Maybe it would mean the world was not entirely broken. Abigail listened. She had never heard anyone talk about grief like this, not as something you got over, but as something you lived with until you learned to walk again. When he finished, she told him about her mother, about watching her die slowly, pregnancy after pregnancy, each one taking more than the last until there was nothing left to take. About becoming the mother when she was still a child herself, about her father's slow descent into the bottle, about the day he told her he had signed the contract and she would be sold at auction, and the way he had looked at her when he said it, not with guilt, but with relief. She said, he was relieved. That is what I remember most. He was relieved he would not have to look at me anymore. Relieved he would not have to feed me. Relieved I would be someone else's problem. Silas said, you were never a problem. You were the only thing holding that family together. She said, that does not mean he wanted me there. He said, then he was a fool. She said, maybe, but he was my father. He said, that does not excuse what he did. She said, I know, but it does not change it either. They sat in silence for a while. Then Silas said, what do you want, Abigail? Not what you think you should want. Not what you think you are allowed to want. What do you actually want? She looked at him. She said, I want to not be sold again. I want to wake up in the morning and not wonder if today is the day someone decides I am not worth keeping. I want to feel like I belong somewhere. He said, you belong here. She said, because a contract says I do. He said, no, because I say you do. The contract is just paper. "This is real." She said, "What is?" He gestured around the cabin. He said, "This. You and me. This conversation. The fact that I look forward to seeing you when I come back from the trap lines. The fact that you asked me not to die. The fact that we are sitting here in the middle of a blizzard and I am not miserable. That is real. The contract is just paperwork," Abigail said. "Did it?" He said, "Yes, because you are here and you are safe and no one is selling you." She said, "You own me for 5 years." He said, "No, I own a contract that says you work for me for 5 years. That is not the same as owning you." She said, "What is the difference?" He said, "You can leave any time you want. The contract says you work for me until 1899. But if you want to leave tomorrow, you can leave. I will not stop you. I will not come after you. You are free. You have always been free." Abigail stared at him. She said, "If I leave, you lose your $40. He said, "I do not care about the $40. She said, "Then why did you pay it?" He said, "Because $18 was an insult. Because you are worth more than $18. You are worth more than $40. You are worth more than any amount of money anyone could pay, and I wanted that town to know it." Abigail felt tears burn the corners of her eyes. She said, "You do not even know me." He said, "I know enough. I know you worked your entire childhood to keep your family alive. I know you stood on that platform and did not cry. I know you have been here for 3 months and you have not complained once. I know you asked me not to die because you did not want to be sold again and because you did not want me to die. And you said both things mattered. That is enough." She said, "What do you want from me?" He said, "I want you to stay. Not because a contract says you have to, but because you want to. I want you to feel safe here. I want you to know that this is your home as much as it is mine. And I want—" He stopped. He looked at her. He said, "I want you to know that you matter, not because of what you can do, but because of who you are." Abigail said, "Who am I?" He said, "You are Abigail. You are strong and stubborn and kind. You are the person I look forward to seeing when I come back from the trap lines. You are the reason this cabin feels like a home instead of just a place I sleep. You are—" He stopped again. He said, "You are the first person I have cared about in 17 years, and I do not know what to do with that, but I know I do not want you to leave." Abigail looked at him. She saw a man who had paid double for her because he thought she was worth it. She saw a man who had given her his blanket and made her shoes and taught her how to set snares. She saw a man who had just told her she was free and then asked her to stay anyway. She said, "I am fat. I am poor. I am the daughter of a drunk who sold me to clear his debts. I am not the kind of person anyone wants." He said, "I want you." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because when I am with you, I do not feel alone anymore. Because you make me laugh. Because you asked me not to die. Because you are here, and I want you to keep being here." He paused. He said, "And because you are beautiful." She said, "I am not beautiful." He said, "You are to me." Spring came. The snow melted. The creek ran high with runoff. Silas took Abigail down the mountain to Copper Falls so she could see her siblings. They stood outside the house where she had grown up, and Abigail's younger sister answered the door. The sister stared at Abigail. She said, "You came back." Abigail said, "I came to see if you were all right." The sister said, "Pa is dead. He drank himself to death 2 months after he sold you. The rest of us are managing." She looked at Silas. She said, "Is he treating you well?" Abigail looked at Silas. She said, "Yes, he is treating me very well." The sister said, "Good." Then she closed the door. On the walk back up the mountain, Silas said, "You do not have to go back. You can stay with them if you want." Abigail said, "I do not want to stay with them. I want to go home." Silas said, "Where is home?" Abigail said, "With you." They were married that summer by a traveling preacher who came through the mountains performing weddings and baptisms for the people who lived too far from town to care about paperwork. Silas paid the preacher $20. The preacher said, "That is too much." Silas said, "No, it is exactly right." They spoke their vows standing outside the cabin with the mountains behind them and the creek running nearby. Abigail wore a new dress Silas had bought her in Copper Falls, green calico with white buttons. Silas wore a clean shirt and his good boots. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Silas leaned down and kissed Abigail like she was the most precious thing he had ever touched. They had 32 years together. They lived in the mountains and worked the trap lines and raised 2 sons who grew up knowing their mother had been bought at auction and their father had paid double because he thought she was worth it. When people asked the boys about their parents, they said, "Our father is the man who paid $40 to prove a point. Our mother is the woman who made him want to." When Silas died in 1926, Abigail buried him on the ridge overlooking the cabin. She lived another 12 years. When she died in 1938, her sons buried her beside him. The headstone they commissioned read, "He paid double. She was worth it." Years later, someone from Copper Falls traveled up the mountain to see the grave. They found the cabin, still standing, and carved into the doorframe were two lines. The first said, "Abigail, worth more than $40. The second said, "Silas, worth everything." The story became legend in Copper Falls. Some people said Silas had been a fool. Some said he had been a saint. But the people who knew them said he had just been a man who saw something no one else saw. He saw a girl on a platform and understood that the bidding was wrong. Not too low. Wrong. Because some things cannot be measured in dollars. And when the town of Copper Falls finally fell silent that October morning in 1894, it was not because Silas had paid $40. It was because he had forced them to confront what they had been pretending not to see, that they had put a price on a person, and he had decided that price was insulting. So he doubled it, not because she was worth $40, but because she was worth so much more than that, and $40 was just the beginning of proving it.